Welcome back to the Illumination Talks. And today we're going to be talking about race and phenotypes. Not because I really want to, but simply because everybody is writing to me about this topic. Various nationalists are putting out a socio-political agenda. So the question for this talk is, was Jesus a black African? Well, here he is. This is the modern black Jesus, complete with dreadlocks and crown of thorns. Well, Jesus the black African Jew. Well, it's not unreasonable, is it? Because Jesus was a Jew. We know he was a Jew. He was a Nazarene Jew. And we know that the vast majority of Jews are black. Okay, enough of the levity. Let's look at this divisive topic in more historical detail. In my lecture series, we've already begun to place the biblical family back into Egypt. The Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. Why? Because Josephus Flavius says so. He calls them our people. And so it's to Egypt we must go in order to research this issue. So, what colour and race were the pharaohs of Egypt? Well, luckily, the Egyptians have been very careful about denoting races and phenotypes, and they've left us many images of the people who visited Egypt. So this next image is from the tomb of Seti I. And from left to right, we have a Libyan, a Nubian, an Assyrian, an Egyptian. And they are all Africans, of course, but they are all of different races and different colours. So on the left, we have a very white-looking Libyan with, I presume that's feathers in his hair, I'm not sure. Then we have a typically black phenotype from Sub-Sahara, the Nubian. Nubia is essentially Sudan, yes. The next person is an Assyrian, and he is again very sort of pale and pinkish. Assyria is essentially Mesopotamia. And then we have the typically bronzed Egyptian. And this bronze colour is a standard depiction for the Egyptians throughout Egyptian art and iconography. Here's another image. This is from the Temple of Hatshepsut. It depicts the Egyptians setting off on an expedition down towards Punt. And again, we see the typical bronzed Egyptian. Conversely, the next image shows us some Nubians, again from modern Sudan. And they are clearly depicted as a different phenotype and a different skin tone. These are black-coloured people and sort of dark brown sort of people. This is from the tomb of Hoi, the Egyptian governor of Nubia. And note they are bringing tribute to the Egyptian pharaoh because Egypt was the dominant nation and the dominant empire in this era. And so here the Nubians are bringing donuts because obviously the Egyptians liked donuts. I presume actually that those are gold rings and therefore quite valuable. But note on the left also, they are bringing a leopard skin, the symbol of an Egyptian priest. And that's important in New Testament research because John the Baptist also wore a leopard skin, as we will see in the lecture series. Okay, so we were looking for the ancestry of Jesus, specifically his race and phenotype. And in the King Jesus Trilogy, I say that Jesus was descended from Cleopatra VII, the famous Queen of Egypt. And that is why Jesus went down to Egypt for his education. He went to the greatest university in this era, which was Alexandria in Egypt. which is why in the New Testament it says, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So Jesus was related to Cleopatra the Seventh. And in turn, Cleopatra herself was part Macedonian Greek royalty and also part Egyptian royalty. The Ptolemies of the Greek Ptolemies of Egypt like to say that they were purely Greek, but they ran a sort of dysfunctional and rather debauched royal court, not unlike, say, Louis XIV. And if we look at the genealogy, you will find a large number of the wives noted as unknown woman. So in reality, there was probably a lot of genetic material in the Ptolemaic line from the previous Egyptian royal line, because they were rich. The previous Egyptian royal line were rich. They were powerful. And if they were anything like Nefertiti, they were probably very beautiful. Who could refuse a concubine like Nefertiti? So here we have Cleopatra the Seventh, part Macedonian Greek royalty and part Egyptian royalty. So let's look at both of these royal dynasties in more detail. So firstly, the Egyptian side of this royal family. Now, a common topic that always comes up when talking about Egyptian royalty is Queen Tia, who is the mother of Akhenaten. And people say she was a black African because of this bust, which is supposed to depict an African sort of phenotype. But no, this is not an African face. This is just a very old Queen Tia, because this was a funerary bust and it was supposed to be dark, and that's why it looked like this. Conversely, if we look at the mummy of Queen Tia, what do we find? Well, here she is, and is that auburn hair? Certainly looks like it. So was Queen Tia a redhead? Well, possibly. But what about her skin colour? Well, we can find that from the next generation. If we look at a lady who was very closely related to Queen Tia, and that again is the beautiful Queen Nefertiti. And if we look at her bust, her very famous bust from Berlin, you'll see that she is a typical Egyptian bronzed skin phenotype. And you'll find that that is a standard depiction of an Egyptian throughout Egyptian history. Okay, so moving on a couple of generations, how about Ramesses II? That's Ramesses the Great, one of the most famous and celebrated pharaohs in Egyptian history. Well, in 1976, the mummy of Ramesses II was taken to France for preservation. And it was examined by Professor Pierre Calcaldi, who is the forensic scientist at the Criminal Identification Laboratory of Paris. And his report determined that he had hair astonishingly preserved, which showed that Ramesses II was a Simnotricha leucoderma, a fair-skinned man with wavy ginger hair. And if you want to look at that report, it's in the Bulletin l'Académie de Médecine, Volume 171, Issue 1, page 119. And remember that the pigments that were examined were from subcutaneous hair follicles, and so they weren't affected by the mummification process. And they showed that Ramesses II was ginger. And here he is. This is the mummy of Ramesses II, with his ginger hair and with his aquiline nose. So the Egyptian royalty, many of the Egyptian royalty, were actually blonde ginger. And if we take a short esoteric diversion down another path, Scotti Chronicon, which is the ancient history of the Scots from the 15th century, and the Labor Gabala, which is the history of the Irish from the 7th century, say that Pharaoh I, who was related to this same dynasty as Pharaoh Akhenaten, and his wife Queen Ankhesenamun went to Ireland and Scotland. Ankhesenamun was the daughter wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten. So did they take this ginger genetic material to Ireland and Scotland in the 14th century BC? Well, what do we find if we go to Ireland and Scotland? Well, yes, we find redheads. So this is a lady from Northern Ireland, and you can see she is ginger, fair-skinned, and blue-grey eyes. And here is another lady from Northern Ireland, and again she's ginger, fair-skinned, and blue eyes. So these chronicles say that Pharaoh I went to Scotland. But before that, they also say that Pharaoh I went to Greece. So the Mycenaean royal family in Greece may have been descended from the Egyptian royal family and inherited their ginger gene. And we can see why this is important in just a few minutes. I don't go into this in any great detail, but this comes from my book, Scota, Egyptian Queen of the Scots. And that is another story for another time. So if you want to know more about it, you should tune into the lecture series for more information. But it's entirely possible that exiles from Egypt, royal exiles from Egypt, went to Greece in the 14th century BC and established contacts with the royal family of Greece. Now let's look at the Greek side of this family. Now, Cleopatra VII, was descended in part from Ptolemy I. And Ptolemy was a general who worked for Alexander the Great. In fact, he claimed to be the illegitimate son of Philip II, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And we know what Alexander looked like because we have several depictions of him. And here is one of those. This is Alexander the Great from the House of the Faun in Pompeii. And Alexander the Great has, as you can probably see, auburn hair. Is that brown or is that auburn? Sort of looks auburn to me. The latter is confirmed by the chroniclers, and we have several mentions of Alexander's hair and skin tone. And the first of these is from Aelian, who says of Alexander, they say that Alexander, the son of Philip, was of a neglectful handsomeness, for his golden hair curled naturally. That's from the Via Historia, 714. And in a similar fashion, Plutarch says of Alexander, Apelles did not reproduce Alexander's complexion correctly, but made it too dark and swarthy, whereas he was actually of a fair colour, as they say, and his fairness passed into ruddiness, redness, on his face. And that's from Life of Alexander, chapter 4. Here we have another image of Alexander, and just as they say, he has fair or ginger curly hair. Now, if you actually go to Greece nowadays, you might say that the vast majority of Greeks are dark-haired. But certainly in the ancient eras, the gods and the royalty were not. They were said to be golden-haired. And the golden-haired gods and royalty of Greece include Aphrodite, Eros, Apollo, Dionysus, Artemis, Helen, that's Helen of Troy, and her husband, Menelaus. And that is why when you see any images of Helen of Troy, she is depicted with blonde hair. So this is Helen by Rossetti, Helen of Troy. But of course, Helen of Troy was actually Helen of Sparta. She was a Spartan Greek with blonde ginger hair. From this, we can probably see that the Ptolemaic royal family of Egypt were golden or ginger-haired. But also, the Ramesside family of Egypt were also golden or ginger-haired. So we have a definite element of blonde and ginger within these royal families. So what of Cleopatra herself? Was she a redhead or a black African? Well, in 2009, with their politically correct hat firmly affixed, the BBC said that Cleopatra must have been black. And we all know that the BBC is truthful and honest at all times. And so here she is. This is the BBC's black Cleopatra. So, will an analysis of history prove the BBC to be correct once more? Will we find images of a black Cleopatra back in history? Well, we do have images of Cleopatra that surely the BBC must have looked at when they were doing their research. And here is one of those, and it comes from the house of Marcus Rufus in Pompeii. And as you can see, Cleopatra is pale-skinned and ginger. Oh dear. Well, we're not off to a good start here, are we? Okay, well, never mind. Let's have another look at another image of Cleopatra. And this one comes from the researches of Dr. Joanne Fletcher, and it comes from Herculaneum, just down the road from Pompeii. And as you can see, Cleopatra was pale-skinned and a ginger redhead yet again. Oh dear. It looks like the old BBC was telling us porky pies. Sorry, for Americans, that's Cockney rhyming slang, porky pies, lies. And with these images, remember that Cleopatra died in 30 BC, while Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed and buried by Vesuvius in AD 79. So the life of Cleopatra was relatively recent history in this era when these frescoes were made. And what they tell us is that Cleopatra was ginger-haired. Okay, but if we look into gospel history, surely things will change. I'm sure that, a couple of generations later, in the first century, in the gospel era, we will find that Jesus was undoubtedly black or brown-skinned. And I know this because the BBC said so back in 2001 in their Son of God series. And we know that the BBC always tells the truth. Well, in that series, the BBC had a team of experts who made a reconstruction of the face of Jesus. And this was the result. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a dark-haired Jesus with dark olive skin, brown eyes, a sort of craggy face, typical of the Christian perception of Jesus being a carpenter. So you can see how our perceptions can be influenced by an ancient lie. And it is a lie because we know that Jesus was a king, a real king, just as my lecture series will prove. But can we confirm this? Because there are no actual descriptions of Jesus within the Gospels. Well, I think we can, based on the history we've already looked at, but also looking at the Renaissance images of the biblical family. And well, here are two of those. This is Mary Magdalene by Luini. And again, you can see she is pale-skinned with curly ginger hair. And likewise, if we look at the Magdalene by Cosimo, here she is, again, pale-skinned and curly ginger hair. But do remember, these Renaissance images resulted from the Crusades. Now, the ancient traditions about Jesus had been hidden from Western civilization. They'd been hidden in the East behind the Council of Nicaea, which divided Eastern Christianity from Western Christianity. It was hidden behind the Council of Chalcedon, which again divided East and West. And it was hidden behind the Iron Curtain of Islam, which cut off Western Christianity from Eastern Christianity. And so these traditions were concealed for nearly 1,000 years. But after the Crusades, some of that information, much of that information, was now freely available in the West. And it quite obviously said that the biblical family were ginger. And that's where these Renaissance paintings and these Renaissance imagery actually comes from. And I was reminded this on my tour of Mesopotamia back in 2008, I think it was. And I was talking to a cafe owner. And I said that his colleague who worked in the cafe looked as though he was Scottish. Well, because he had ginger hair and freckles, even though he was born and bred in Mesopotamia. And the cafe owner said, no, he doesn't look Scottish. He looks like Issa. And Issa, of course, is the Arabic for Jesus. The tradition was, of course, that Jesus was ginger-haired. And that's why we get images like this. This is from Afghanistan. And this is from Pakistan. So why do Muslims dye their hair bright orange? Well, it's because they want to look like Muhammad, who also dyed his hair orange with henna. And we have this not just in the traditions, but we have it in quotes from the Hadith. And one of them says that the Prophet said the best things to change grey hair are henna and katam. That comes from Abu Dawud 1959. And another quote, this one says, Uthman bin Abdullah says, I looked into the container that held the hair of the Prophet, and I saw a few red hairs in it. And that comes from Al-Bukhari 784. So why did Muhammad dye his hair? Well, the answer is because he wanted to look like the previous prophet. And the previous prophet to Muhammad was Jesus, who was also ginger-haired. So even through Islamic tradition, there is this tradition that Jesus was again ginger-haired. And we get a similar story from the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the ancient scrolls that were found on the shores of the Dead Sea at Qumran. And the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the coming of a new Messiah. And this new Messiah has been identified by Professor Robert Eisenman as being the biblical Jesus. Anyway, it says about this prophesied Messiah, and his barley will be red, and there will be lentils on something, and small birthmarks on his thigh. That's from Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q534. So this is what the new Messiah will look like. So what does this mean? Well, this is where you need to know a story very well before you try and decipher the text. And the clue here is that seror, the Aramaic for barley, can also be translated as meaning hair, red hair, because barley, as you can see in the image, is a hairy seed. And this changes the story somewhat. So what the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually saying is that the prophesied Messiah was supposed to look like this: red hair and lentils. And very pretty it is too. Interesting, isn't it? So, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jesus was not simply a naughty boy, he was also ginger with freckles. And that's what the prophecy said. So based upon all of this research and much of the other research I look into in the King Jesus Trilogy, I composed an image many years ago of what the true Jesus would look like. And this is that image. And as you can see, he is supposed to have blonde ginger hair, a long beard and moustache, a straight nose, a diadema headband, that's the blue bit at the back of his crown, a purple cloak fastened with a fibula, and a crown of thorns. And that was my image of the biblical Jesus. And then, just a couple of years later, long after I'd made this, commissioned this depiction, they discovered a mosaic of Jesus at the synagogue at Hakkuk, which dates from the 4th or the 5th century. That's just to the west of the Sea of Galilee. And this will be discussed much more in the later lecture series, so do tune in to that and see the evidence that is given there. Anyway, the depiction in this mosaic is of Jesus having, and you can see it here, blonde ginger hair, a long beard and moustache, a straight nose, a diadema headband, that's the two wavy bits at the back of his head, and a purple cloak fastened with a fibula. It's exactly the same as my depiction, which I had made about 4 years earlier. And here they are, both of them together. And this is the true face of Jesus. So, in summary, both the Egyptian and the Greek royal lines were blonde ginger. I think we've established that. And according to all of my work, Jesus was descended from these royal lines, as my lecture series will amply demonstrate. So unlike the misinformation projected by the BBC, it seems certain that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were actually pale-skinned and ginger-haired with freckles. And that is a sort of minor revelation, isn't it? Anyway, if you have any questions on this talk, and I'm fairly sure there will be many, do get in touch with us through the Patreon website, where we'll organise a few question and answer sessions. And do tune in again to the next Illumination talk. Thank you.